Good evening. I'm Jerry Rubin. I'm the director of the Janelia Farm Research Campus, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation in our ongoing series, Dialogues of Discovery. When you came in, hopefully you all picked up one of these brochures that tells you a lot about our speaker tonight, Jennifer Chayes. So I'm not going to go through and repeat this. I'm going to assume that you've studied it carefully, but there are a few things that were not mentioned in here that I'd like to mention. First of all, Jennifer was born in Manhattan and raised in White Plains. She's the daughter of Iranian immigrants to this country, so she's a first generation American. She's won many awards. You saw all these awards, and one that I noticed that wasn't listed in here, she won the Leading Woman Award that recognizes women leaders who serve as exemplary role models for today's girls. And this was from the Eastern Massachusetts chapter of the Girl Scouts. So this wouldn't be so noticeable, but Jennifer told me.
You're wondering why.
I can't, I'm not mic'd, so all right, thank you. People are very good at helping me do my job here. So this is one of the advantages of working here. Jennifer told me that when she was 7 years old, she was kicked out of the Brownies, which I guess was like the junior Girl Scouts, because she was told by the troop master that she asked too many questions, and if she asked one more question, they were going to throw her out. So it's very nice that she was honored by the Girl Scouts for the very same thing that they threw her out of the Brownies some decades before. And you'll notice that she's won other awards for her role as being a role model for women. And so I'm particularly pleased that she was able to come early today and spend part of this afternoon meeting with a couple of dozen of Loudoun County's finest high school female students here to talk about her experience. I have no idea what they talked about. I was escorted out of the room. I heard they had a good time. And now we're going to hear from Jennifer about networks.
Okay, so am I mic'd? Yes, I'm mic'd. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jerry, and I'm going to find out who kicked you out and tell the world. So if you know of an organization that kicked Jerry out or would like to kick Jerry out, please tell me. Those are all the Janelia people laughing at the second phrase. Okay. Okay, and I really want to thank these young women who came and spoke to me. It's just wonderful to be able to talk with them. I feel very, very honored to be in front of these young women. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is interdisciplinarity in the age of networks. So the motivation for this is that we are living in an age of networks. There are networks like the internet and the World Wide Web. There are social networks, and notably huge online social networks. There are biological networks like gene regulatory networks. There are general resource allocation networks, constraint satisfaction networks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some observed networks, and then I'm going to talk about what someone with a background like mine, so mathematics, physics, theoretical computer science background, does with networks, some classes of problems on networks, and then I'll talk about tons and tons of problems, and then I'll focus for the last half of the talk on a couple of specific problems, and one of them will have a biological flavor in honor of where I am, but it won't be neural networks, unfortunately, which would be what I really should be doing here. I haven't yet done a piece of work on neural networks, so maybe if I do one, they'll invite me back. Okay, so observed networks. So I'll just mention the classes that I'm thinking about, the classes of networks that I'm thinking about, are technological, social, economic, and biological networks. So I come from kind of a math background, so what do? I model these networks as graphs. So graphs have vertices and they have edges, okay? So some of the technological networks, like the internet, is a network of autonomous systems. So one of those would be like AOL, which I think is a local company, MSN, Yahoo. These I view as the vertices of the network. They can shut themselves off from the rest of the network. If there's some kind of attack, some kind of worm, they can shut themselves off. And so inside they have their own internal network. And then there are edges, which are the connections from one autonomous system to another autonomous system. Janelia has its own autonomous system, or a university, Harvard.edu is an autonomous system. Okay, the World Wide Web is a huge network. There are about 1 trillion static web pages. Those are the vertices of the network. And there are hyperlinks directed from, let's say, my web page to your web page. So if I point to you, that doesn't mean that your web page points to me. It's it's in one direction. There are cloud computing data center networks. I've been working a lot on cloud computing networks. You may not realize that on the order of 3% of the power in this country is going towards cloud computing networks. So, when you do a search, you don't think of the fact that actually there's, some big data center sitting near a river or some power source that is churning away in response to that search. The thing that's really scary here is that the power consumption is doubling every 5 years. So, if we don't watch out, we're going to have to invade some other country very soon just to run our data center networks. Okay. Any in mind, yes. So there are lots of technological networks out there. There are social networks. There are offline social networks, which people have been studying for years. Disease, you study the network of, how the SARS virus spreads, for example. There are online social networks, Facebook, LinkedIn. This is a data visualization of that network. Data visualization is a huge field now. It's interesting. I was just talking to someone here today who is telling me that how you visualize the biological networks they are finding here is a huge problem. So I know some of these young women were telling me they want to go into biomedical fields. The visualization of networks is actually a big open question. How do we visualize them in ways that allow us to draw conclusions? There are mobile phone networks, instant messaging networks, microblogging networks like Twitter. As you study these networks, you have to be very careful about people's privacy, okay? And there have been some notable studies that have appeared in premier journals which haven't been careful about people's privacy and in which you can figure out who called whom. So as we start to study these and as we start to study gene regulatory networks in individuals, we have to be very, very careful about privacy. So there's also research being done on privacy. There are economic networks. So in the autonomous system internet, there are 3 different levels. If you are on the top level, then you don't have to pay other top level autonomous systems to carry your traffic on a very rough level. When you go down to the second level, you have to pay them on the first level to carry your traffic. On the third level, you have to pay them on the second level and on the first level to carry your traffic. So you get all kinds of strange internet routing based on the economic incentives there. There are people who who study that. There are market networks, business-to-business networks. There are bipartite graphs of buyers and sellers. There are matching networks like the medical residency matching program or school choice programs matching up students and schools. The Nobel Prize was just given this year to Shapley and Roth for studying those matching networks, the economics of those matching networks. Okay, biological networks. There are phylogenetic trees. I'm not sure where she is. Tandy Warnow is in the audience somewhere. She's in the back. Tandy, there's a seat for you up front. Tandy is an expert on studying phylogenetic networks, okay? There are gene regulatory networks. So, DNA is transcribed to RNA, is transcribed to proteins, and then the proteins can come and they can sit on the DNA and they can affect the transcription of genes, okay? And so that leads to a feedback where you get a gene regulatory network. There are real neural networks, which is what many, many people here work on. They work on the Connectome project and other aspects of real neural networks. Okay, so there are many, many networks. So what does a theoretical scientist like me, a mathematical scientist, do with these networks? Okay, well, we can try to model them. We can think about how do we sample from them. Okay, if they're very, very large networks, sampling accurately from them is really, really important if you don't want to have to take in the entire network and calculate something on it. We can think about processes that take place on these networks. We can think about trying to construct an algorithm on a network that gives us some conclusion about something that's going on or something useful about the network. We can also do network reconstruction algorithms. So you have indirect information or information about some part of the network. From that, can you conclude something about the structure of the entire network? Okay, so let's start off with modeling networks. So if I'm going to model something, I always have to ask, what are the properties that I'm trying to model? Okay, most biologists will model more details than a physicist or a mathematician will model. Okay, so I'm just going to take a few of the gross features of some of these networks and start off by trying to model just those few gross features. Okay, so one is small diameter. Okay, so you've probably heard about 6 degrees of separation. You may have heard about that. Stanley Milgram in the 50s, I believe, did an experiment in which he gave postcards to people somewhere in the Midwest and said, I want you to try to imagine a short path to somebody who lives in Massachusetts who has a certain occupation. So if you're sitting in the Midwest, and you want to mail something to a teacher in Massachusetts, who would you pass it to, who you think could most quickly get it to that teacher through the smallest number of hops? And he did that, and he found that on average there were 6 degrees of separation, 6 hops to get to the right person. There was just a study on Facebook this past year in which they found that typically people were only 6 hops away from each other. You could get to anybody else on Facebook in at most 6 hops, typically. And it turns out this goes back to 1929. There was an author, a Hungarian author, who had a story called Chayes, in which he hypothesized that people were 6 degrees of separation from each other. I don't know how he thought of that in 1929, but that's what he conceived of there. Power law degree distribution. So this is a function of many of these networks that are in some way related to human beings. Okay, so if I ask, what is the probability? What are the odds that I that I have K neighbors, that I'm connected to K other people. Could fall off exponentially, which would be very fast, or it could fall off more slowly. Well, it turns out it often falls off more slowly. Falls off like a power law. So things that involve human interactions, often when they measure the network and ask, what is the probability that I have K neighbors, it often falls off like 1/k to a power, which sounds fast, but it's actually slow. It's much slower than an exponential decay. Okay? And that's why, you often see these things plotted in terms of their logs, and you get a straight line. Okay, then aging of vertices. So on many of these networks that form through human interactions, for example, the AS Internet, the World Wide Web, older vertices tend, on average, to be more highly connected. Okay, this is why web spammers, that's search engine optimizers, will try to buy up old websites that have been old web names that have been abandoned, and try to make these false connections to raise you up in the search engine ranking. So if you know how a search engine works, you'll understand this. If not, let me just tell you how a search engine works. The early search engines, like 15 years ago, used to use content and language to find the most relevant web pages. Okay, now the later search engines, Google, Bing, Yahoo, use the structure of the web graph. So they use graph theory and algorithms to find the most relevant web pages. And to lowest order, what they do is something called PageRank. So let me take that web graph, which has hyperlinks from my web page to your web page, or from your web page to CNN, and let me take a random walk on those hyperlinks that you've put in, okay? And I might get stuck, okay? It might be that I go into some page and there's no way out of it, okay? There are no hyperlinks on that page. Well, so every 7 steps, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a jump to a random site, and I'm going to keep doing this for a long, long time, and I'm going to approach some stationary distribution, which is the odds of getting to any particular page. Your page rank is your relative weight in that, okay? And so, CNN is a very high page rank. I personally don't have such a high page rank, although I have a reasonable page rank because I'm on the Microsoft site, which itself has a pretty high page rank. Later ranking algorithms try to detect anomalies in this, because what happens is, you might have noticed that a few years ago, search engines seemed to be better than they are now. Now, if you go and you look for some travel or something, you find that you can't get what you're looking for. You keep getting these commercial sites that are not actually what you're looking for that are coming up. The reason is they're making false links to those sites. They go pay a search engine optimizer to make false links to those sites to raise its page rank, okay? And that's why you're finding those instead of finding what you're really looking for. And so what Google, for example, started doing was saying, oh, we're going to just pull off these sites that we see that are not very interesting, that have been artificially upgraded by doing this. And then people started suing them and saying, you've ruined my business and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's easier to do it with a ranking algorithm which looks for anomalies and kind of just downgrades those anomalies. So you can use mathematics instead of lawyers. It's cheaper. It's better, okay? So the first model of this was the Bashi Albert model, which is that at each time step, a new site comes in and it links to M old sites. So you go in, you form your web page, and you link to M other web pages. And how do you choose which ones to link to? Well, this is kind of a rich gets richer model. I link to the ones that already have a lot linking to them, okay? So the probability that you attach to an old vertex is proportional to the number of neighbors that old vertex has, okay? So, you all want to link to the popular people, okay? The first rigorous work on this was done very soon after that. Okay, well, how about trying to do variants of this that take into account other things? There are variants of this preferential attachment model that take into account fitness. So let's say that you have some older site. It should have more things linked to it because it's been sitting around for longer, but some newer site is born, which is actually a much better site. Okay, let's say MySpace versus Facebook, okay, or AltaVista versus Google. MySpace has been there longer, but you're more likely to have a link to Facebook than you are to have a link to MySpace because Facebook is more fit than, it's more attractive. So you can look at things like this, and you actually, if you're a physicist, you find things you really like Bose-Einstein condensation phase transitions in here. Really fun stuff, okay, if that's what you like. There are competition models in which you say, okay, instead of just a rich get richer type model, I'm going to try to optimize something. I'm going to attach to this one or that one based on some optimization scheme. And if you do that, you get different kinds of models, okay, which can explain things like the structure of the AS intranet or some biological data. There are what are called fully game theoretic models in which you go back and forth. You don't just choose once. You go back and forth until you reach a Nash equilibrium, it's called. Okay, so there are all kinds of models. Okay, so one thing you can do is model. Another thing you can do is sample. Now, why would you want to sample? Well, let's say I wanted to calculate PageRank, okay? So I've got to take this random walk on this 1 trillion site graph, okay? And wait until my walk settles down. Well, that's just going to take a really long time. That's going to be really expensive. You would use up all the power in the company, in the country if you were trying to do that, okay? So what I want to do is I want to take a sample of the web. I don't want to take the whole thing. How do I sample properly, okay? Well, to deal with this, what we did was we developed this theory of graph limits and testing, which says that I'm not going to look at the graph at a finite stage. I'm going to take a limit of the graph. And this actually, we really liked this because this actually took us back from thinking about technology to some new mathematics. So there are now hundreds of papers on this and textbooks on this and everything, because we actually got some new mathematics out of it. So for me, that's very nice. Sometimes we take math and we try to say something about science, but sometimes in trying to deal with how you describe science, you develop some new mathematics. Okay, how about processes on networks? Well, there are a lot of processes you might care about. You might care about the flow of information on a network. Okay, John Kleinberg is a very good computer scientist who has done a lot of work on this. How does information flow? What are the most efficient networks to get information to flow? Okay, what other kinds of processes can you think of? Well, how about a virus spreading, an epidemic? Okay, there's a lot of questions of how do epidemics spread, either real physical ones like SARS, or a virus or a worm on a computer network that knocks out computers. And you find that on these power law graphs, okay, on these graphs in which you have long tails to the distribution of the number of neighbors, epidemics spread much, much faster, okay? So on the kinds of graphs that arise naturally in human interaction, epidemics end up spreading much, much faster, which is why in cases like SARS, they worry so much. Okay, there are things like viral marketing. There are a lot of people studying the spread. Okay, I want to give away free phones to somebody who will tweet about how wonderful their free phone is. Who do I choose in the Twitter network? Who do I choose in Facebook if I want to market to somebody? Okay, then there are algorithms on networks. So this is, let us try to do something on a network. Okay, so an algorithm is like a prescription. It tells you what to do to extract some information that you want. Okay, there are lots of algorithms on networks that we use to get information we'd like to know about the network. So there are ranking algorithms for web search. I told you about PageRank. Recently, I've been working with a grad student to do really, really fast versions that are sublinear. You want sublinear because the N is a trillion, okay, that do it much, much faster. Okay, they don't get exactly the right answer, but they do it much, much faster. Sometimes you'd rather have a worse answer fast than the perfect answer 200 years from now. Okay? There are clustering algorithms, okay, for things like collaborative filtering. So what do I mean here by a bipartite graph? A bipartite graph means you have objects on one side and objects on the other side. So my objects could be people and movies. Okay, so Netflix has this thing where they ask you to rate movies 1 to 5, okay? So what they have is they have every movie in their library, okay? And then they have you, and you rate some very small percentage of those movies. And yet, I don't know what you guys have found, but I have found that it really recommends movies that I like, that I'd never heard of, because I tend to like these really obscure movies. And how does it do that? It puts me into a particular cluster. It says, oh, if I give this and this and this rating, then I'm in this certain cluster, and I'm probably going to like that too, which somebody else in the cluster likes. Amazon does the same kind of thing when they say, if you like this book, you'll like that book, or if you like this product, you'll like that product. Okay? There's actually some really deep math that has come out of this, what's called a matrix completion problem, where you have a sparse matrix, and how do you fill in the rest of it? Really, really interesting math there. Okay, there are algorithms for multicasting, which is taking something and broadcasting it out to a lot of different sites. There are algorithms for something called web hosting. So Akamai is this amazing company that started about 12 or 13 years ago from a theoretical computer science paper by an MIT professor and his student. And they just said, if I wanted to be able to access information fast, no matter where I was in the world, where would I put copies of that information to make access for people faster? And that's web hosting. They host pieces of the web in various places. They mirror it. That was a simple algorithm that they came up with and published in a conference, and it became a huge business. Okay? And it really speeds up. Were it not for companies like that, all websites would go down when a lot of people wanted to watch a particular thing. There are fast algorithms for identifying influential sites. If you want to do viral marketing, or if I want to reach out to this network of women and I want them to go to some conference, okay? Who do I go to give that information so that it will spread on your Facebook, on Facebook? Okay? There are algorithms for recommendation systems in online trust systems. So let's again think of Facebook. But let's say you said to me, I trust this friend and that friend and that friend where movies are concerned. okay? And so you take some subnetwork and you say that you trust them, or I trust them where math problems are concerned, or whatever, for different domains. How would I take that information about the people I trust and propagate information on their opinions so that I could get a recommendation for myself? Okay, and I will actually talk a little bit about this problem. Okay, finally, the last class is network reconstruction algorithms. So Candy, who's in the back, is one of the world's experts on phylogenetic network reconstruction. Okay, it's used for real philo. It's also used for linguistic evolution. It's used for other things. But you know something about the species that are around now. How do you conclude that whole tree from which they evolved? How can you say things about that tree just by knowing things about the leaves? Gene regulatory network. So if I know that, this protein is overexpressed in the presence of that one, how do I conclude something about the network? There's reconstruction of learning processes and networks of synapses. So, you can look at a little 400 neuron worm. You can see how it responds to certain things. People try to reconstruct what the learning process is from that. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about this gene regulatory network work also. Okay, so a couple of specific problems, the recommendation systems on trust networks. So if you were to designate and tell me you trusted certain people in certain domains, how could I get you a recommendation from that? And then reconstruction of gene regulatory networks. So I'm going to just focus on these two and give you a little more details. So from a social network, something like Facebook, I could build a trust network. I could make it a directed graph. That would probably be the most reasonable thing to do. Because if I trust you on movies, that doesn't mean that you trust me on movies, okay? And I could also make it a multi-graph, so it could be, wow, I really trust you on movies, and I sort of trust you on movies, okay? Okay, so I'm going to assume, just for simplicity, that every element of your Facebook network is in one of three states, okay? It either has no opinion on this particular book, let's say, or it likes the book or it dislikes the book. I mean, I could do something like, Netflix, where I had 5 things instead of 2, but let's just do 2, okay? So it either likes it or it doesn't like it or it doesn't know it, okay? How do I propagate that information to derive something that would be a good recommendation for you? You've told me you trust these people. Okay, so how do I get a recommendation? Okay, well, there are lots of things I could do. I mean, I could be stupid, completely forget the whole network structure, just say, oh, I'm going to take a simple majority. You would look at me and you go, why are you doing that? You have this whole network structure. Why do you just take a simple majority? Okay, well, I could do lots of different things, right? So how do I choose one thing I could do over another thing I could do? Well, so we took an axiomatic approach in which we said we want the outcome to satisfy certain properties. Okay, that's a reasonable thing to do. So, for example, if everybody who said they liked it switched to disliking it, and everybody who disliked it switched to liking it, then the recommendation should just switch sign, right? If I have 2 networks that are exactly the same, except that, this person is Sally and that person is Jane, or that person is Jane and this person is Sally, it doesn't matter because the network structure is the same, I should get the same answer. So these are both reasonable. Something called positive response. You make things so you weren't sure, you make something positive, then the answer should be positive. All these other things that people like Arrow. There's a great economist named Arrow who did this kind of thing. So there are all these different things that you might say, these are nice properties I want my recommendation system to have. Okay? So we wrote down all these nice properties. And then we said, oh, here's an impossibility theorem. Okay, here's the fact that there's no recommendation system that will satisfy all these reasonable axioms. It sounds really good. Honestly, it's not so, it sounds like it's impressive. It's not so impressive. I can keep making demands on you until you finally break, okay? So I just keep adding things until you can't satisfy everything anymore. So the thing that's kind of disturbing is that everything we asked was reasonable, but still, there's nothing that does that. Much more interestingly, we said, let us pull out any one of these 6 axioms. Let me not ask that there's independence of irrelevant alternatives. Let me not ask that it's neutral. Let me not ask blah, blah, blah. Then if we have any 5 of the 6 remaining, we could come up with an algorithm which satisfied that. Okay? And they were reasonable kinds of recommendation systems. Okay? So there's work that shows that PageRank, which is what was used by Google, is the answer to some axiomatic approach, actually, just some very reasonable axiomatic approach. You ask, where did these algorithms come up with? That's not how they derived it, obviously. But you might ask, what properties do ranking or recommendations have? Okay. And the kind of interesting thing here is that we're talking to people in our product groups about using this to monetize a social network. Everyone says, oh, Facebook's worth, I don't know how many, billions of dollars, and how do you actually get some money from it? Well, you can also do this for mobile phone networks and things like that. So you could use it for that. So if you wanted to make money, you might say, fine. So now let's do something which is very, very different from that. Let's look at reconstruction of gene regulatory networks. So here, as I mentioned, the standard dogma is, and I'm sure the women I was talking to have learned this in their biology class, right? DNA is transcribed to RNA, is transcribed to proteins. The proteins can go and they can sit on the DNA. They can even sit on non-coding parts of the DNA, and they can either make something get more or less transcribed. Okay, and this is the feedback mechanism. Okay, and from this, we get an interactome. Okay? So, problems with this gene regulatory network are, at the heart of many diseases. So, how do we infer network structure from partial data? That's one question. Another is, can we identify particular nodes which we feel are responsible for the dysregulation, okay, and are causing diseases in certain individuals, okay? Now, this is all highly simplified because, the same disease can look very different in different individuals. It manifests itself in the same way, but it's actually very different. Okay, and what are more nodes in combination viable drug targets? If we could go in there and fix things at one or several of these nodes. Okay, many of the women said to me, oh, I want to do biomedical engineering. Well, this is some of the kind of stuff that one day, hopefully, some of you will be doing and helping to cure serious diseases. All of this science is at a very elementary stage right now. Okay, so the drug discovery paradigm, there are lots of different kinds of data you can get which give you indirect information, feed them into computational models, and you maybe come up with points of intervention. Okay? So I'm going to just talk about DNA chips microarrays, okay? And they tell us which gene is being expressed in the presence of which other gene in a particular set of circumstances, okay? So, do I have more or less of this protein than I would normally have in the cell? in the presence of that one. So I've done this to the cell, or I've done this to the organism, and what has happened? And that's one shot. And then I do something else, and I get another snapshot. Okay, so from the differential expression of a particular gene, so do I have more or less than I would normally have of the corresponding protein? We infer the node weight of the corresponding protein. So I'm a mathematician, so I think nodes are vertices and edges, okay? So so my proteins I'm thinking of as my nodes. And then my edges are, I'm going to get edge weights by asking how likely is it that this protein interacts directly with that protein? How do I get that data? Well, we have an organism and we have all kinds of data on this organism, and there are databases out there which are very, very noisy, which is another thing that one has to deal with in biological data. It's extremely noisy data, but which give known or believed interactions of pairs of proteins. Okay, so how do we determine the network most likely to have produced this data that we're seeing? Okay, now I'm going to have a little bit of math for a couple of slides. Okay, so I have a graph, and I have a cost on every edge, Cij, okay, cost I to j, and I have a subset of my vertices on the graph that I want to be in the final output, no matter what, okay? And I want to find a tree which contains, so I tell you, you better have node 1, node 17, and node 23 in the final tree that you output. You can have 2 through 16 in there or not, each one of them as you want. And I want to minimize the cost. So I want a tree which minimizes the sum of all the edge weights in there, and it better have these nodes in it. And it's a tree, so it's got to connect all of it. Okay? And in general, the minimizing tree contains nodes, and it contains something in addition to 1 and 17 and 23. Okay? So those I call Steiner nodes. They're named after a man named Steiner. Okay? So those extra ones that show up in the solution that I didn't force to be in there are called Steiner nodes. And there are computational issues, and a number of years ago, working with some students and some people from Italy, we came up with a really fast way of computing these things. Okay, now why is that helpful? Okay, so now a little more math, but it's the biological the biology problem also. So now I want to do something a little more complicated. I don't want to tell you 1 and 17 and 23 must be in there, and I don't care about the others. What I want to do is I want to tell you, hey, if 1 is in there, I'm going to give you a certain prize. Okay? And if 17 is in there, I'm going to give you another prize. And if 23 is in there, I'm going to give you another prize. Okay? And I still have these edge weights in there. And what I want to do is I want to find the thing which minimizes the sum of the edge weights. But what I want to do is I want to give you a bonus whenever you get one of those prizes. And if I took this lambda and I let it go to infinity, then whenever this prize is positive, you're getting infinite reward. So you're always going to choose 1 and 17 and 23 as I let lambda go to infinity, no matter how good or bad the solution is here. So this goes over into the normal Steiner tree problem as I let lambda go to infinity. Okay, so this is the problem I'm going to look at, and I'm going to try to take some biological data, and I'm going to try to map it into this problem. Okay? Use this problem to represent that biological data. Okay, so I want to find a tree which minimizes this, some of theCijs, and I'm helped whenever I include a node which has a positive prize. Some of them have 0 prize, some of them have positive prize. Okay, so where do I get theCijs? TheCijs are telling me in my database of my organism. So I look up yeast, and I see that yeast has 4,600 proteins and 14,000 pairs of known interactions. And I tell you that if you include something which is known to interact a lot, that's going to help you, okay? Because if this probability were 1, okay, then I would get the log of 1, which is 0, which would be great because I'm trying to minimize this. If this probability is less than 1, then I have the log of something less than 1, so that's negative, so this becomes positive, and I don't want that because I'm trying to minimize this, okay? So this comes from information about the organism. And then where do I get my prizes? Well, in a particular experiment, some gene is overexpressed or underexpressed relative to background, okay? And if it is, then I say, hey, it's kind of likely that this is in some way involved in what's going on, okay? So I'm going to give you a prize. I don't really care if it's underexpressed or overexpressed, just as long as it's not background, I'm going to give you a prize for it. And the more and the further away it is from background, the bigger the prize I'm going to give you, okay? So what you're going to land up doing when you want to minimize this is you're going to land up including the edges which are known to have a lot of interaction along them. And you're going to land up including, for any given experiment, the proteins that are under or overexpressed. Okay, so Steiner node is a node which I don't force you to have, but which you might have in the solution. In the prize collecting Steiner tree problem, if I don't give you a big prize and you still include it, so it's not much underexpressed, it's not much overexpressed, it's pretty much sitting in your background and you still include it, I call it a Steiner node. So let's see, where's the Steiner node here? This is the whole network. This is the solution I chose. This guy here is a Steiner node. So that guy is not very big. He doesn't have a big prize, but what he does is he allows me to connect my network and get my tree. He's not very underexpressed or overexpressed, but somehow he pops out as being important as I'm trying to reconstruct the network. So these are proteins whose genes are not differentially expressed, but which nevertheless seem likely to participate in the network. Okay? So now let's look at an example. We have the yeast pheromone response pathway. We did this because when we started out, we were all physicists and mathematicians, and there are a lot of tables on yeast, so we didn't have to do any biology to start out. And we could just look it up. And so there are lots of proteins. There are lots of known protein-protein interactions. So we considered, and this was all in the literature, 56 large-scale data sets. For each data set, we got a set of prizes. We constructed 56 trees. We overlapped them to get one network. And this is what we found. Okay, now this guy here is a protein that wasn't forced to be in there, but that looked like it was pretty important to connect the network. So there were the terminals, the ones that we had to put in there because they were way underexpressed or overexpressed. And then there were these other ones that were expressed roughly only at the background rate, but that came out as really important. Okay, and that is one of them there. And so are those really important? How do we know if they're really important? We have no idea if they're really important. Okay, so what do? Well, a crude thing you can do, but you can't do anything if you're a mathematician or a physicist. But then you go make friends with some biologists, or you guys, when you go to school, you will do both biology and mathematics and computer science so that you can go into the wet lab by yourself and do it. But we made friends, and so we did an experiment to knock out the gene corresponding to that, and lo and behold, the pathway failed, which is experimental proof that this actually was important. So you never would have known that this was important because it's as if this is sitting there at background level, not underexpressed, not overexpressed, but it's important in that pheromone response pathway. And you find this by doing this kind of crazy math, okay? But you might say, who cares about yeast, okay? No one cares about yeast, okay? So mammals are much, much harder, though. They have incomplete data, 10 times as many transcription factors, huge non-coding regions. So you need fast algorithms. But that's good because we do fast algorithms. Okay, so we looked at glioblastoma, which is a long way from yeast, okay? Glioblastoma is a kind of brain cancer. It's the, human cancer, well-known human cancer with the worst outcome. About 10,000 people a year die of it in the U.S. It's about 1 year from the time you're diagnosed to the time you die, even if you have surgery and chemo and radiation. And the outcome, it's much more common in men than it is in women, about 4 to 1. Ted Kennedy had this kind of cancer. This is why, when we knew he had glioblastoma, we knew he probably wouldn't survive very long. Okay, so can we find pathways using this crazy math, this prize collecting Steiner tree problem? And actually, in this case, we put in more data than just the DNA chips. Okay, so how do we choose the root of the prize collecting Steiner tree? How do we choose the thing that we really want to be in there no matter what? Well, if you think about biology, maybe it's good to choose a receptor protein because something that sits on the cell membrane and is a receptor protein, is likely to be involved in a signaling pathway. So we picked something called EGFR. Why did we choose that? Well, variants of this are known to be very common in many human cancers, in fact, in 60% of the glioblastomas. So we found a certain pathway, okay? This pathway, so what do the colors mean? Well, this red, so something that's red means that it really has to be in there. Of course, this has to be in there because we chose it. It had to be in there. But other things, too, were way underexpressed or way overexpressed, so they had to be in there. How big the circles are has to do with how central the node turned out to be in the resulting network. So what happened was when you get this network, you see, oh my, actually, this network's making a lot of sense to us because there are a lot of things that we know are really important that the cell do properly that seem to be central in this network. But like, how about some of these guys? Like, how about this one? Okay, that had no penalty, wasn't underexpressed or overexpressed. It's very central, but it's not known to have anything to do with this. So the top 5 nodes ranked by how central they were in the network are these. The first one is active in many types of cancers. It had a relatively large prize. That second one had no prize. Well, what is that? Well, it's the estrogen receptor. Okay, so this was the first pathway link between glioblastoma and gender. The estrogen receptor was not underexpressed, not overexpressed, but what's going on is that it turns out to be very, very important here. Okay, experimental test, we added, in addition to the thing for the node that was the root of the tree, we added estradiol, which is estrogen basically, and together, in culture, they inhibited the growth of glioblastoma. So again, this is kind of a proof, and if you could pump estrogen into the brain, which you can't. In fact, brains that have estrogen are great brains, I'll tell you. But then you would have a possible drug therapy for glioblastoma. Okay, we did also multiple signaling pathways, so we do forests instead of trees. Why do you care? Because in many systems, there are multiple signaling pathways. We put in an artificial node, okay, that connected everything, and then it broke apart, and you got multiple parallel pathways. And you could find these parallel pathways in addition to identifying these important proteins. We did it on yeast, and sure enough, you got different trees corresponding to different things we knew about the yeast pheromone response network. We did it on glioblastoma, and in addition to this EGFR one, we found some other ones that were rooted at the receptor proteins. So we're starting to see things that look like interesting, meaningful biology coming from this kind of abstract mathematics. So the summary is that everywhere, at least everywhere I look, but you know, I've got this hammer. So everywhere I look, I see large-scale networks, okay? In technology, social networks, economic networks, biological networks. If you come from math and theoretical computer science, you realize that you can model and analyze these networks using branches of mathematics and computer science, graph theory, combinatorics, probability. Probably some of you are learning a little bit of combinatorics and probability in high school. And eventually, if you go on, you will learn game theory and algorithms, okay? The results include new theories, new theorems, new experimental predictions, maybe new business models for extracting some money from Facebook, and possibly even new drug therapies. Okay.
You mind answering some questions, do you?
Oh, no, of course not.
Thank you for a beautiful talk.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Bert Gold. I work at NIH. I saw a film that's on the internet that talks about creativity and the notion that Sergey Brin and his partners came up with the algorithm underlying Google through thinking about science citation index and cross-citing. And then you show this beautiful axiomatic system for developing it. Mm-hmm. So my question is really philosophical. To what extent does the kind of aesthetics of the thing sort of, in an intuitive sense, end up agreeing with the mathematics of the thing to make it make sense? So I'm kind of asking the Weil symmetry.
So yes, so what you're saying is the PageRank algorithm, which Larry and Sergey came up with, called PageRank. You saw that. That was the cute little faces with the arrows pointing around and the random walk. That turns out to be the solution of an axiomatic approach to a ranking problem. So there are those of us who think that the axiomatic approach itself is beautiful too, but I think that that in fact the reason that, you'd have to talk to Sergey and Larry, but the reason that they liked this, which is very much like a random walk, the reason they liked it was that it did have a lot of these properties. They weren't articulating the symmetry, but they were on an intuitive level making sure that whatever they did had a lot of these properties. So they were intuiting these properties that a reasonable person would want the algorithm to have. The independence of irrelevant alternatives, maybe not, but certainly many of the other properties they were putting in. They would have been, when people do algorithms without an axiomatic approach, there is an aesthetic to the algorithm. It's also what I was talking to these young women about, which I love that they understand, which is that math and science are incredibly creative subjects, okay, which a lot of young students don't understand. They think, if they go only into the arts, are they able to be creative? But you are putting your values and your aesthetics into an algorithm when you create it. And this piece of work, which is not ours, but it was actually done by one of my co-authors on the ranking algorithm, was trying to make explicit what those properties were that were in the PageRank algorithm.
Yeah, I have a very simple question about the diameter of the social network. You just said that about 90 years ago, it was estimated that there is a 6 degree of separation.
Well, it was an estimate. I don't know how he came up with it, this Hungarian
author.
He
sent some notes.
He had a short story called Chayes. You can go look up a translation of it. So, yeah.
And is it still true that 90 years later, after all this development in social network, is still 6 degrees of separation?
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Well, no, Facebook, I think it was around 5 or something, but it wasn't that different. It wasn't that different. That was what was absolutely shocking, that if you imagine a path, okay? So somehow we are imagining these short paths in ways that correspond to what we now find when we construct our social networks, okay? When we actually physically construct them by friending people and by finding, people who went to high school with you that you thought you would escape from, finding you again, So somehow he was already realizing this, and now this is like the physical manifestation of it. Yeah.
Walk it over.
You were just going to walk it over. Okay. Do any of the young women who asked me so many great questions before have any questions about this? Or maybe I'm putting you too much on the spot. But remember, you're supposed to act like you have no fear. Remember, that's what we were discussing. Act like you have no fear. Great. Grace, do you know that she is named after Grace Hopper, right? She is, right? She is. Such a great person to be named after. Yes.
I was just wondering where I could find the published papers on the glioblastoma study. It actually kind of has to do with my research now. So I will give you my card. You will send me email or friend me on Facebook or whatever, and I'll send you those references. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah. It's very cool that you're working on glioblastoma or something related to it. My uncle died of it, which is why I started working on it. It's a horrible disease.
From a layperson's perspective, I'm sitting there and I'm working on Facebook. And I'm terribly frustrated that I have a cousin. I don't want to read her political opinions at all. I want to read about her marathon training and her family. Why won't Facebook at this point sort through your friendships so that you get value out of some friends?
Well, I do believe that is the future of social networks. I believe that social networks are when the social networks are able to deal with this data, and it won't be long, you can either specify, you will be able to either specify what you like, or they will be able to tell just by how long you linger in certain areas, and then do, natural language processing to see what this is about. They will certainly, I am waiting for, 10 years ago or so, Sergey Brin and I were on a panel together talking about what is the next big thing. And amazingly to me, it hasn't happened yet, but I said it's not going to be the search engine, it's going to be the filter engine. Okay, it's going to be the thing that, and now I need it even more than I needed it then because there was so much there. So the thing that filters things out, but we are at the same time now, 10 years later, much further towards personalization and being able to do what is called a machine learning algorithm to understand how things should be personalized to you because, you know, somebody else might actually love the stuff that you hate and vice versa. So, yeah.
So this personalization of these social networks, one of the things that we're hearing about that we're so concerned about is that in the past, your social network was much less directed by yourself. It was you bump into all manner of people in your everyday life, and now we're self-sorting all the time. And do you foresee any implications for where the world is going, where we're just going to be all walled off?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, I worry about that, you know, with what television stations and everything people choose to, you know, we have so many choices that we are able to segregate ourselves. You know, you can think of social engineering, maybe, you know, some forward-looking person like Mike Bloomberg would say, oh, we're not supposed to do that. I mean, so we could, of course, go and insert random links. I think something that's interesting is that in the science of algorithms, if you don't insert randomness into algorithms, you typically don't find solutions quickly, okay, because you get stuck. You don't find what you're looking for, what you want. You don't converge to it. So if you're looking for a metaphor for what we're doing, actually, I think we are causing ourselves to not find what we would actually want because we are not having some of that randomness. Since we start off on a philosophical note.
Maybe that's a good note to thank Jennifer again for joining us.